Hey guys, Marcello here. Today we're going to be doing the recap of what happened in the markets last week, the stock market, economy, finances. One of the things that's really curious that happened this week is that the federal government in the US is practicing for a preparedness event, let's say, for a potential radiological event in Austin, Texas. We have the longest river in Italy that has completely dried out. So much so that the ocean is literally going back into the riverbank. And we have another situation where the US stocks suffer the absolute worst losing streak since the Great Depression in the 1930s. Let's get started. A lot of negative news. But unfortunately, it's kind of the direction that we're heading. Even Ben Bernanke, which I so kindly call the Ben Bernanke, which is the previous president of the central bank of the United States under George Bush Jr., George W. Bush and Obama as well. And even he said that we're headed into stagflation, which is basically a stagnant economy, and high inflation, which was what happened, for example, in the 1970s. But one of the things I do want to tell you just right off the bat is whenever things are really bad, it's a great opportunity to be able to make money or do very well. So I've been in this industry now for almost 22 years, whether it's trading or teaching people how to trade or actually funding traders with my money. And even when you go back and look at the statistics, the most millionaires were created during the Depression, the Great Depression in the 1930s. So even though I talk about a lot of negative things that's been coming, just remember that there's a huge opportunity here as well. And even if you, for example, learn how to trade, don't expect you're going to make $1 million from one day to the next, right? But if you could make an extra $100 or $500, trading in just the morning, or maybe doing swing trading where you can check on it during the day, not being sitting there on the computer forever, that obviously helps. All right, so keep that in mind. So as I mentioned, US stocks suffer the longest losing streak since the Great Depression in the 1930s. The latest decline leaves the S&P 500 with a 20% down from its peak. It's officially in bear territory or a downward trend. It's negative now officially, right? And the S&P 500, remember, is one of the stock indexes that provides kind of an overall view of what the economy is doing. The Dow is just 30 stocks, so it's not really an overall view. So the S&P 500 is kind of a benchmark. So if the benchmark is going down 20% from its peak, we know that things aren't doing very, very well. The Dow also has dropped 600 points. It's an 8th weekly loss for U.S. stocks. All of the stocks in the U.S. were negative. Canada had a bright week, went up 0.20%. And as I mentioned, the Ben Bernanke, the bank, he predicted that we are most likely headed towards the 1970s stagflation, where it's a stagnant economy and very high inflation. Overseas market news, the European markets are mostly mixed. 1-2% or so. Russia being the emerging market that it is, it was just under 3%. Latin American markets are also mixed as well. They had bigger movements. In Africa and the Middle East, we have Saudi Arabia being most negative of all at 3.27%. And then in far east, Asia and Australia, we have the Philippines being the biggest winner at 5.75%. Not a lot of big news in the Bitcoin space after the absolute collapse last week and the Luna stablecoin UST Terra collapse. Other than that, we only have Chile, which is adding on to be another one of the countries, for example, that's looking to launch their own CBDC, which is central bank digital currency, or Bitcoin for governments, as I so kindly have called since the beginning of time, government coin, which is what I think is what we're going to end up with essentially. Bitcoin higher for the week, 0.67% at just under 29,000. And then in the commodities, here comes the amazing positive news, guys. Italy's longest river has dried up, mainly due to the fact that the snow cover in the Alps is under 50% what the average would be. It's the lowest snowfall that they've had in the last 20 years, and it's so severe that the seawater is being sucked back into the riverbanks. And this is pretty serious for Italy, among other things, right? Because we've had all these kind of convenient food disaster events that have happened over the last few weeks and over the last few months. But now it's threatening Italy's breadbasket and where they grow food. So I'm just going to kind of, if I can remember all of this stuff, that's a lot has happened. We have those mysterious food plants that are burning in the United States, two airplane accidents, coincidence. We have places like North Dakota and a flood. They're not able to plant food. And it's just, we have disasters all over the place. And then add on top of that, the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is a vast majority of the wheat in the world as well. Not vast majority, but a huge chunk. And so we have all of these potential situations with these food events. Just remember, let's put on the conspiracy theory hat on. The preppers were right. Buy some food. And I plan to do a video for you guys about how to prepare for the zombies. That's what I call it, the end of the world. The wonderful times that are coming that await us. US gallon of milk is up 25% since before the pandemic. Retail bacon up 35%. Evidence suggests that the prices are going to increase even more. And one of the things that was, this is the real cost of inflation, right? It's not 8.5% like the government states. This is what you guys are seeing in the stores. And I've always said it's about 20 or 30%. This year, 2022, it could probably get to 50%, which is something like Argentina, for example. 15-piece order of chicken nuggets, it was $13. And I'm going to do the math here on my phone. The 15-piece chicken nuggets was $13.95 before the pandemic hit. Now, a lot of people are starting to do a menu price that's based on the market, kind of like seafood and lobster, where the price depends on what the market price is. So right now, it's about $27.95, which is the market price. So if we deduct that from the previous price for the 15-piece nuggets, $14 difference, which equates to a 100% increase and what the cost of chicken nuggets are. Very soon, a lot of people are saying that it's going to get to $34 for 15-piece order of chicken wings. So now we're talking about something like 120% increase. Sri Lanka now has some serious protests. As I mentioned last week, they're lighting houses of politicians on fire and literally beating up politicians on the street. The UN has warned that the global wheat inventories have fallen to their lowest level since 2008. As food supplies of wheat, the actual storage, the reserve that we have is down to 10 weeks. And remember, if you guys remember about, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, I mentioned to you guys how the few of the guys that I follow that kind of are in this space in terms of the food talked about how wheat is the leading indicator when it comes to food. So if this is happening to wheat, this is going to happen very soon now to the rest of our food supply. China now is seeking to replenish their crude stock reserves with cheap Russian oil as the whole world looks to ban Russian oil. We're going to get into that because they're not really banning it, right? They're just talking heads. They're looking to go ahead and strengthen their ties with Russia, which is not a good thing because we're literally creating another powerhouse between China, Russia, and other countries that are involved there as well. Europe is working towards banning essentially all of the imports from Russia as well. Gas prices on average under the Biden administration has reached $4 a gallon in every state for the first time ever. And we also have oil closing at a 4-week high. Obviously, we have the situation with the close downs and the quarantines in China, in addition to the fact that this war, people are afraid about what's going to happen with the supply side, because obviously if they cut off the supply from Russia, that's going to increase significantly the price because we're not using less oil, right? U.S. crude for the week is up. Also, Brent, they closed just around, the U.S. crude was about $110. U.S. crude, or Brent, I should say, was just under $113. And precious metals for the week back up after the U.S. dollar took a hit and came down quite a bit. Gold went up 1.90% at $1,847, while silver went up just over 3% at $21.88. Financial and banking news, Argentina inflation. And this is actually a really good lesson because it seems to me we kind of go through these cycles over time when it comes to economies and empires, right? And it's an old saying where bad times creates great men creates great times, then great times create bad men, which is where we're in now, and then bad men create bad times. It's kind of just the same thing about the generations of wealth, where the third generation spoiled brats essentially burn all the money, right? So Argentina inflation, the U.S. inflation rate, according to the government statistics, which remember aren't accurate, is 8.5% year over year, which is the highest percentage since 1981. Remember that the percentage or the calculation that they use right now isn't the same as 1981. So it would actually be closer to 20% if they use the same calculation as in 1980. But let's use the 8.5% as an example. Argentina right now has an inflation rate of 6.7% from 1 month to the next. So they're looking at an inflation rate of 55.1% according to what the government is calculating. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Argentina is in the 1900s, one of the reasons why it's called Buenos Aires, the Paris of the South, is because it was the richest country in the world in the 1900s. It was literally growing at a faster pace in the 1913s than the US. It was one of the 10th wealthiest nations per capita in the world. Now, the US, for example, is 10th and Argentina is the 89th. And what they've been voting for since basically 70 years is socialism. So just keep that in mind when you guys are voting, if you want to go out and just jump into poverty. US is now considering a full block on Russia's abilities to pay US bondholders. This obviously, if they freeze the Western banks, this is going to cause a big problem for Russia and they could face an economic crisis. UK inflation has soared to a 40-year high to 9%. Highest since records began in 1989. This obviously includes as well the spiraling cost of energy and also food. The Chinese government is planning on implementing a $5.3 trillion pump into the economy. That's about a third of their $17 trillion economy. And this is kind of a perfect example of what governments do. They create the problem and then they give you the solution, which is more government. So notice that they created the economic not crash, but the economic downturn with their lockdowns because of the pandemic. And now they're going to create an even bigger problem by printing money essentially and just injecting it right into the economy, which is basically what the US is doing. And the Russian currency is now the best performing currency in the world. It smashed a 4-year high against the US dollar and a 7-year high against the euro. At least 20 European gas buyers have opened ruble for gas accounts with Gazprom Bank, which is the central bank in Russia. And this is one of the things that's really not funny because a war isn't funny, but it's really interesting to me because we're supposed to be giving them all these sanctions. Meanwhile, Putin is playing chess while the West and NATO is playing checkers. They tried to collapse the economy by saying that they weren't going to buy anything from Russia. Unfortunately, Europe requires Russian energy to be able to function. And Russia, Putin decided to say, well, we're not going to give you anything unless you pay in rubles. So that skyrocketed the demand for rubles, and now even the income that Russia has received this year for gas and oil has spiked 50%. So for all the talk that we're doing about sanctions, for all the talk about the excuses that we're paying higher prices because of Russia, which isn't true, we're essentially paying Russia, and especially a lot more now, just because they started the war and we put these quote unquote sanctions on Russia, we're literally paying a premium so they can continue with their war. This is the people that we vote for, right? Political news. China's President Xi is attempting an unprecedented third term this fall. He's going to extend his role as one of China's most powerful leaders since Mao Zedong. Obviously, his policies are tremendously popular. The zero COVID policy, where they literally lock people up in their homes. The staunchly supporting Russia in regards to the war against the United States, which is obviously because they're both competitors to the US, and the tech giant crackdowns that they've done recently. But the resulting economic situation has sparked an intense debate about what's that effect on the actual population. So analysts are talking about stakeholders at large and the public as well, due to the effects of the actual decisions that the government of China is making. UK unemployment in economic news is the lowest since 1974. So remember, the government always manipulates its statistics, if you guys can say it right. And so they talk about, oh, we have the great economy, we have the best unemployment rate for years since 1974. But what they don't tell you is that the actual money that you're earning is collapsing due to the inflation rate, because every dollar that you make doesn't have the same purchasing power. The example that I gave you with the chicken nuggets, the same 15-piece chicken nuggets, for example, has gone up by 120%, 130%. Have you gotten a 130% raise? See how that works? That's the part that they don't want you to connect. Eurozone GDP went up by 0.3% in quarter one, same rate as what we had in quarter four of 2021. So the Eurozone economy is showing resilient despite all the variants of COVID and also the war. seasonally adjusted unemployment rate in the United States went down to 3.9%, which is the lowest unemployment rate since the monthly survey began in 1974. And excuse me, that's for Europe, not the United States. And the number of new unemployment claims in the US went up to a 4-month high to 218,000, which is 18,000 higher than what the expectation was going to be. So we're starting to see some cracks in the US economy as well. Corporate news, shares of Walmart and Target both collapsed, horrible earnings. In the case of Target, they went down over 25% due to the fact that their net income collapsed by 52% in the first quarter. This has to do, they're both reporting their profitability is down because of surging fuel costs, surging food costs, and also wages. And remember that we talked about the wages in the previous video, talking about the fact that because of all the job openings, companies have to increase the prices that they pay for labor, increase everybody's salaries to make sure that they hire people, right? Because they need workers. We're at a point now where the number of job openings is at a record high. So even though we have a situation where the economy is supposedly recovering, people can't find enough workers. So they pay people more to be able to get them in the door. And that helps with the inflation rate. Not the only thing that happens with inflation, but one of the helpers as well. Siemens, the big company out of Germany, they decided to leave Russia after nearly 170 years of business. And in trade news, analysts have reduced some 1.6 trillion of economic growth from the economy in 2022. Obviously, again, they're blaming the war in the Ukraine as well. I'm not reporting as much details in Ukraine because of the war, because I figured, we kind of all know what's going on there, right? It's a tit for tat. And hopefully it'll end soon because war isn't good for anybody. And in investment news, Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, is risking running out of fuel. They're finding a way to keep a refinery open because they're not getting the oil and the gas mainly the oil from obviously the situation with Russia. It's on the Polish border and it's the main supplier of jet fuel and gasoline for vehicles there in Eastern Germany. And if they don't find something soon, then the 4th largest economy in the world, in addition to the largest economy in the Eurozone, can be affected quite a bit by literally not having any oil or gas. International events, we have a new pandemic now, which is the monkeypox. It's the worst outbreak of monkeypox that they've seen in Europe. Prepare yourselves because, as I mentioned to you guys before, conspiracy hat is on. This is never going to end. We're literally going to have a never-ending pandemic until the end of time. The G7, which is the group of the 7th largest economies in the world, are taking part in a pandemic exercise. Remember when that happened in 2019 before the previous pandemic? Simulating a fast-spreading and dangerous outbreak of smallpox virus originating from leopards. So they're practicing a potential outbreak when, just like they did the potential outbreak in 2019 before the pandemic in 2020. And Bill Gates has the best luck, doesn't he? He invested in a synthetic baby formula company. Oh, and all of a sudden we got a shortage. Most luckiest man in the world. Unless, of course, there's a conspiracy theory at foot. And in unusual facts, natural disasters, the government of the United States is beginning a major radiological incident drill in Austin, bringing 30 agencies together in a field training exercise to combat threats of radiological events or attacks. There are no coincidences. So that's the news for this week, guys. Let me know if you guys have any questions. Don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, because that hasn't gone up in cost. And we'll see you next week.